Hello everyone, I'm Instructor Hollon, and this lecture is on metaethics, the second lecture on metaethics, and today we're going to look at non-cognitive realism and non-cognitive anti-realism. So we continue our discussion from last week, and we pick up with Dimmock and Fisher, uh, 2017, the zero-cost textbook for one of the zero-cost textbooks for the course. So let's begin with non-cognitive realism this week. This view says that moral judgments are not cognitive judgments, so they don't make um, semantic claims that aim for truth, and they don't make uh, there's no psychological state that pertains to something like a belief that the moral judgment is true. Rather, it is a non-cognitive psychological state, something like a desire or emotion, okay, not a belief. So think of it this way: it doesn't require thinking about it, it's more reaction or feeling about something. Uh, and insists, though, that uh, moral properties are nonetheless real. So this is how you can characterize non-cognitive realism. Now, this view is virtually unattested in the source material in the literature on ethics, and in fact, using the zero-cost textbook uh, material for the course, um, we can see that there's really only one person on the contemporary scene who holds this view, and his name is Kahane. I've linked his article in the lecture for this week. If you have a chance to read it, please do. It's enjoyable. He's a good writer. And the view is provocative. He claims that our ethical judgments do not then make evaluative and objective semantic claims, but nonetheless they express objective, evaluative facts. As I had explained earlier, uh, this is the idea. Okay, so this view says that our moral judgments are indeed expressions of emotion, evaluative facts, express evaluative facts, as I should say. Uh, but and they pick out moral properties in the world, so you don't need that cognitive part again. So Kahane disagrees with Hume's anti-realism and his anti-realist account of moral properties, but he agrees with his non-cognitivism. Okay, so he thinks they are expressions of emotion, but that the emotional responses, in fact, track real uh, evaluative facts in the world. Okay, it's he calls it a robust metaphysics. There's the properties are there, and we're just reacting to them, responding to them, but we're not thinking really about them. Okay. Now, the objections with this position are that emotional is the main objection. We'll trade on two cases for counterexamples. Okay, so we look at the theory by conceptual analysis, and we ask, okay, are the conditions set forth by this theory, is it sufficient for moral judgment? And then we ask, is it necessary for moral judgment? If it's both, then it looks like we have an adequate definition. If it's neither one or both, there's a problem, because then you can have the target phenomena or facts that you're trying to explain, and your definition doesn't work. It doesn't apply. So then you won't think it's a good definition. And that, in fact, turns out to be the case with this suggestion, non-cognitive realism. So a person may be, now this objection is then therefore labeled emotions or objective evaluative expressions are insufficient for moral properties. Here's the first leg of the argument. There's two connections, okay? There's two cases. So in the first case, we look at the sufficiency condition. A person may be in an emotionally expressive state, but not be in a moral one, right? So Sally loves vanilla ice cream and experiences joy at the thought of eating it. She's in an emotional state, but there's nothing more. There's no moral quality to this reaction and this expression, right? So in this case, Sally has an evaluative judgment, but does not express a moral property, fact, judgment, etc. Okay, so the second case, then we look at the necessity condition. Does Kane's theory, is it necessary? Is Kane's theory necessary for morality? And in this case, we can think of counterexamples easily. So in the beloved Star Trek world of the Trekkies, there's a famous Vulcan character portrayed by Leonard Nimoy called Spock, and he's an alien Vulcan race that is notorious for not having emotional responses, at least not the way humans do. And in the series, in the movies, he comes off very cold, cool, and almost never cracks a smile. And then it's kind of like that's just the MO for the character in the fictional world, right? So we could see how emotional responses won't track moral judgments easily. With Spock, he can certainly make moral judgments and not be in any emotional state, right? But more down to earth, you could even that's just an example, but you could think of other cases like that easily, right? Think of the old Dragnet series, and Detective Joe Friday, how he would be very cool and he would just say, just the facts, ma'am. And he could render moral judgments even though he was very cool. You couldn't detect any emotional responses from him in times, right? So the idea is then emotional responses and expressions are not necessary for moral judgments. So with both cases, Sally likes ice cream and gets excited but isn't in a moral state, and Joe Friday doesn't have to be in a moral state but can make a moral judgment. We see that emotional expressions or reactions, evaluative expressions of just pure expressions of evaluative facts, this Kane's theory isn't sufficient or necessary for moral properties and for moral action and judgments. Okay, so most ethicists don't find this. We don't take this route for the very reasons that I just explained. Conceptually, it doesn't look like it's anywhere close to the definition for morality, moral properties, for which we are looking. Okay, so we turn then to, that's the only game in town for that position that of which I'm aware, and that I could find in 6-7 books we used for the course. So we're going to turn to the non-cognitive anti-realism. Now this was Hume's position. Hume thought, yes, there is no cognitive feature of moral judgments, and there are no moral properties. And he went further and said, and the emotional responses that we have just don't track moral properties because they're not there. So this is where he just is bolder than Kahane and says, look, if you think they're emotional responses, you should go all the way and think there's no moral properties there. And he probably recognized the same kinds of cases that I just pointed out. You could have emotional responses and expressions without any moral properties. So it wouldn't be a reliable guide to even detect properties. It would be kind of ad hoc if it to propose it and have it just ad hoc track moral properties. How do we know that? So Kahane, his theory is just widely rejected. So Hume says, yeah, we should reject that idea and just be anti-realist. So the idea is non-cognitive anti-realism. Okay, so we react to moral, and we have moral reactions and react to events in the world with moral, as if there's moral content, but there really isn't any, and we're not really thinking about. We shouldn't really be thinking about them. We're not really thinking about them. It's just really in kind of programmed psychological responses, perhaps, and aversions. And there's no properties there beyond just natural properties in the world with atoms and electrons swirling. Okay. So the first version of this theory, non-cognitive anti-realism, at which I want to look, is called emotivism. Hume theorized then that moral statements don't even aim to accurately refer to features of the external world. Okay, not in any cognitive sense. He thought it was just like a desire or a desire to get away from something, but without thought, more default or instinctual responses and behaviors. Okay, so rather they are just expressions of desires. This is called Humean theory of motivation. Okay, because belief alone, then belief thinking is insufficient for moral action. Okay, so it's just more instinctive again. You don't have to think about it. Think, is this good or bad? Should I react to this or not? You just have it. Okay, this is an early form of what later we called emotivism, but just we refer to it as motivism anyways. There's fine differences, but it's fine if you refer to it as this early form of emotivism. That's basically what Hume was thinking anyways. Okay, so let's look at the argument he has for this position. Okay, he says, remember the is-ought problem. We can look at nature and see that there are unreliable guides to moral judgments. So if we ask something about how should we behave, how should we treat our young? Well, if we look to the wild, in some cases we see that animals eat their young. Or we might ask, how should we behave with our partners and spouses, right? Well, if we look to the wild, we see that some animals eat their partners. Okay, the famous Black Widow scenario comes to mind. So Hume says, yeah, nature isn't a reliable guide to tell us how we should behave, so we don't want to look there. Okay, so this is his famous is-ought problem. To move beyond facts, you need an evaluative theory, but he didn't think those could pick out facts. There were only two kinds of knowledge, truth, for Hume, and the statements of facts and logic. Logic being necessary by reason alone. So facts by observation and logic. Ethics didn't fall into either of those categories. And this is called Hume's guillotine. Guillotine. Truth is kind of like there's two. That's it. And since ethical truth doesn't fit either scheme, disjunction, it's left by the wayside. Okay, so so on this view, then there are no moral properties. We should reject them, he says, because nature is not a reliable guide to morality and moral judgments. So he assumes then that moral properties must be natural, because notice how he's refuting the naturalistic account. It's really something like egoism, I think he was looking at, right? But that just ignores the potential and the possibility that moral properties might be non-natural. And so maybe he's thinking in rejecting the divine command theory before that even, that the non-natural category was kind of not wasn't a real contender to think about a theoretical explanation in meta-ethics for moral properties. Okay, but we can see how that's now, and that's a bit slick, a little too fast, because there are other ways to explain natural properties now. And there are other ways to explain non-natural properties that don't depend upon divine command theory or even Platonic realism. So, so Hume's argument is it's antiquated. I shouldn't say a bit, it's antiquated. He was writing some time ago at the beginning of the Enlightenment, and very influential Scottish philosopher. But as with many things, through time, we make further developments in fields, right? And so some reasoning, some arguments, some ideas become antiquated or obsolete. Now, this is a worry with Hume's argument, because it's couched in this. It assumes one understanding of natural properties, and it just dismisses non-natural properties. So we think it's a little too dismissive. And doesn't look reliable. Then it'll be too strong. Another worry, and we'll look at this objection. Another worry is that non-naturalists disagree and have their own responses, then accounts. Okay, so we should look at those. Think of More's open question argument. He agrees that if you look at nature, you won't find sufficient grounds for moral judgment, and so probably probably an unreliable place to locate moral properties. But he still thinks there are moral properties. He just thinks they're non-natural. Okay, so there was a more modern version of Hume's theory that emerged by Ayer and Stevenson, and it's a clever one, and we'll look at it. They look at moral expression as one of emotion rather than desire. So this is really where we get the emotivism. But again, you can read it back in Hume. He's just talking about desires. But to be technical, uh, the what we call emotivism emerges later. Okay, but they group together under this rubric: non-cognitive anti-realism. Yeah, that gets them all together. So according to Ayer and Stevenson, to say that murder is wrong is to say boo to murder. But that's really what they were all thinking. Anyways, some form of that. But Ayer postulated then a theory of emotive meaning. Okay, now this is a theory. The moral statement meaningfully reveals an emotion, but that's meaningful. Okay, but ultimately, then the expression is still just one of emotion. For Hume's case, desire, motivation, or lack thereof. Right. So this form, the Ayer's form, is called non. It does not necessarily lead to nihilism then because it has a meaning. The meaning just is the emotional expression. So you can avoid nihilism that says there is no meaning, right? It's just that the meaning is an emotional one, not a propositional one, not one like meaning like words meaning. What do you mean by that, right? It's no meaning is it's like more primal than that or something. Okay, so Stevenson follows Hume in holding that our moral statements register disapproval and approval, so it's more back to the desires there. Again, you can group them together though. So in this way, they can explain our motivations to behave morally. Okay, now let's look at the responses to this main theory, these different ways of characterizing it. The response, the first one is that it's psychologically unlikely. Okay, uh, our moral statements are generally thought to express true or false claims about the world. If you have a moral disagreement with someone, virtually no one, unless they're schooled in this way of thinking, will think that we're just talking about differences of emotional responses and reactions. Okay, so we are not merely booing an action in an academic or indirect way. So it's psychologically unlikely that everyone would be wrong. Okay, so we just don't behave that way to moral scenarios. Okay, so the next problem then is the problem of explaining why emotivists know better about what moral properties are than what normal people would think. Then this, we'll call it the pre-philosophical sense view. Not, it's the normative response, not normal that they're crazy or something like that, but the more standard response to emotional response, and that's all. I mean, okay. So emotivists have a problem explaining how they know better what we mean by our moral statements. We have direct access to our own intentions or what we mean. And when we say something is wrong, we know we're not merely saying boo. And they're saying, no, you mean this. And you're saying, no, I meant this. And say, no, you mean this. No, I meant this. So they might just disagree that that's what you should mean, but they can't tell you that's what you do mean. You see the problem there? Okay. So Ricky may want to steal a piece of gum, but does not because he knows it is wrong. So in this case, his judgment, stealing gum is wrong, is not the same meaning as boo to stealing gum because he wants to steal the gum, right? So it can't be just the desire then, a problem specifically for Hume and Stevenson there. So to the point, Ricky is in a position to know what he means better than emotivists, okay, say he means, all right? So let's look at the next problem then, and this one is the problem of moral statements are not emotional statements. Very similar to the one I raised previously against Keynes' view, but this has a little spin on it, and it's very clever. You'll find this in the aforementioned zero cost textbook I mentioned, Dimmock and Fisher. So in this scenario, imagine Charlotte may feel that it is wrong to avoid paying taxes. She knows it's wrong to dodge paying taxes, okay? And she feels it, even though she is depressed about the statement. Cognitivism says there is a moral fact about the world, independent of her desires, and this depresses her. However, It's not clear how non-cognitivism can make sense of the situation, since her initial moral feeling is that it is wrong to avoid paying taxes, even though she does not like to pay herself. So she knows it's wrong, but she already doesn't like it. But she knows it's wrong to avoid paying taxes, but she doesn't like paying taxes. So if non-cognitivism was right, then because she doesn't like paying taxes, really, that should be the reason to say then that uh, you shouldn't you shouldn't. This is a little tricky. So the reason um, that non-cognitivism says she the reason it's wrong to avoid paying taxes is simply because she has this moral expression, this reaction to it. It's um, that maybe aversion or something like that. Um, so it's difficult. I'm having difficult time explaining how emotions then can account for this distinction on her part, because she knows it's wrong to dodge paying taxes, but she doesn't like it. So that because she doesn't like it, it should be wrong then to pay taxes. But see, they don't map up right, and we know that that won't work. So what we find then is that moral statements are not simply emotional statements, or emotional statements just don't give us the ground for the move to the emotional statement itself, to the moral statement itself being true or false or whatnot. So moral judgments simply can't track emotional judgments. You see that? Um, so maybe then there are higher order emotions, second order emotions about emotions. You could try to say something like that if you're a non-cognitive anti-realist at this point. This runs into some kind of problem. This runs into a vicious regress problem, though, because the same problem just arises repeatedly, and you find yourself in a vicious circle, and there's no way out. So we just are stuck with the problem then, recognizing that moral judgment, the emotional judgments don't ground or track moral judgments the way they should. Okay, so on the next problem, this one is called the problem of moral disagreement. When people debate the moral status of contemporary issues, say euthanasia, the debate appears to use logic and reasoning. Okay, we're debating, not just yelling at each other. Maybe sometimes we do that, in fact, but the idea is that we're reasoning with each other. Okay, so just like scientists, economists, and computer technicians disagree about matters independent of their own minds. Okay, so these are mere disagreements about individual desires, according to non-cognitive anti-realism, and it's difficult to see how these can be resolved when the moral expressions are merely emotional disagreements. How do we know that everyone just should say boo to X? Where should say boo to X? Where did that should sneak in there? It just looks like a fact that everyone says boo to X, something like that, and it doesn't say anything about whether or not they should or should not boo X, right? Uh, so when they are, then people just boo. When they are in moral disagreements, people just boo or hurrah together, apart from any concern with truth or facts on non-cognitive anti-realism. And it sounds like a cackle of hens or something. There's no reasoning going on there. Moral disagreement is akin to personal disagreement about subjective preferences for favorite flavors of ice cream. And moral disagreements just do not look like the kinds of things that emotivism says they are. Okay, this objection is spelled out by Brandt. Let's look at now another position for non-cognitive anti-realism. This view is called prescriptivism. Okay, so Hare theorized that moral statements express more than disapproval. Rather, they express a subjective prescription by which we expect others to act in accord with our judgments. They express a subjective prescription, you just should agree with me, by which we expect others to act in accord with our judgments. Hence, prescriptivism captures the action guiding nature of moral statements because we have this expectation without the need of moral truth. It also explains moral disagreement better than emotivism because we can legitimately criticize someone for inconsistency. They're not being consistent with their own expectations. You see that? Even if we cannot charge someone with falsehood. Hey. So for example, Christina may think that murder is always wrong, and yet think it is acceptable to murder this terrible dictator. The problem is not that the latter is false, but that it is inconsistent with the former judgment. So let's look at objections to close the lecture with prescriptivism then, okay? So the first objection is called the problem explaining why prescriptivists know better. It's very similar, basically the same objection that we raised against the other version of emotivism at which we just looked. As with emotivism, one problem with prescriptivism is explaining how it is that we know what we mean by our moral statements, how it is that they know what we mean by our moral statements better than we do. How do they know? Again, it's just an emotive expression, and we just expect people to agree with it, to accept it, or to have the same response. How do they know that's what we mean when we already know that's what we don't mean? We run into that very same problem. Okay, if we accepted that that was the case, we wouldn't have these moral disagreements, and we would be in this strange scenario world. We couldn't legitimately deal with a moral disagreement because we wouldn't be sure which expectation is correct, right? And this leads right into the final objection that I'll consider, and this is the fact of moral disagreement. So even though prescriptivism explains moral disagreement better than emotivism, its explanation is still inadequate. The charge in some disagreements involves falsehood and not merely inconsistency. So if people do not make inconsistent claims for themselves, then the original problem of disagreement arises, right? So how do we determine who is correct when two or more consistent people disagree? These conflicts look irresolvable, but surely, in some cases, they should be resolvable. So prescriptivism won't be able to handle as many cases as normal realist theories would be able to handle, like the theories at which we looked. Okay, and that will be a problem for the basic groundwork of this theory. You can't get off the ground because of this problem. So we looked at some different theories for non-cognitive realism and anti-realism today, and we considered some objections. And I know this material was trying in the course, that's why I saved it for last. I get a little tongue-tied going through some of it because all the concepts and having to follow the arguments just precisely to get the points. So I understand if you were wrestling with the material, and that's perfectly fine. That's okay. This is an introduction to ethics, so you're not writing your master's thesis or a doctoral dissertation. I hope that the material has been enjoyable and informative. Certainly no one is expected to master it, but if you have any questions about anything we covered before the end of the course, please feel free to reach out to me by email. Office hours are fine. You could interact with me, specifically ask a question in the discussion forums, and I'm always happy to help. So thank you for joining me today, and I hope everyone has enjoyed our course through ethics. Goodbye.